Yeah, this works.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for testing. Good morning. My name is Roland Stens. I'm a senior QA architect with Optimus. And this is basically a start of a series of quarterly talks about testing, improving testing, or be more practical about testing. And today we're going to talk about an interesting topic, and we're going to skim the surface a little bit because it's potentially a big topic, but hopefully we'll get you interested in it. Okay, so I have a quick agenda here. I will quickly skip over it because you will go and see it. What's happening? So this one. Like Pankaj mentioned, we're going to do a series of these presentations, and all with a little bit of a background of sensible, pragmatic, effective testing, right? There's a lot of theoretical stuff in there, but what I like to do is sort of make the connection with what you do in practice and how you can apply some of these, sometimes lofty ideas and whatnot to daily practice. Okay, so a few things, the topics that we have been thinking about, risk variations, automation environments, team building, performance testing, but we're also very much open for topics. If you have a topic that is really near and dear to your heart, please tell us, and if we get multiple of such requests, then, we'll sense that need, and we'll state something that we can hopefully all learn from. Okay. Good. Well, test dilemma. Since who is actively involved in day-to-day testing here in the room? Test management, about 5 or 6. Who has been involved in an active manner in testing in the past, in any way or form? Almost everybody. Okay. So some of the things that I will be saying then is not that strange, right? So we have a dilemma in testing. Since testing is largely a combinatorial problem, right? We have so many variations and so many combinations that we need to test in order to make sure that we have enough coverage, that we do a good job and whatnot, that, it's overwhelming. It is too much. It is very common if you apply some basic math on your variations that you have and your combinations that you can have, that you could literally have in the hundreds of millions and even billions of variations that your software could experience. Now, it's very easy to see that such a thing you can't test easily. You have to make sometimes tough decisions. Expectations are typically high, test it all, make it work, make it faultless, make it bugless, don't make any mistakes. If you leave a bug in there, then it's testing's issue and fault and whatnot. How that is the case, because we never created the damn bug to start with, but somehow that is a very common, common notion. Testing is often on the critical path. One of the later activities in projects often, so it gets the squeeze, and that's hard because when you get the squeeze, you have to make even harder decisions on what are you going to drop and what type of impact that might have on your end result. And the testing squeeze is all too common, right? That's why I asked is everybody, who is working in testing or has worked in testing. If you haven't experienced the squeeze, then we need to talk, because I would like to work where you're working, right? In short, we have too much to test and too little time to do it. So we need to focus. And we have to accept that we cannot test everything, right? Now we have to choose what we will test. So where is our time and effort best spent? How can we focus on the right things? Enter a testing focusing technique, risk-based testing. So that's what it is. It's a focusing technique. It's not so much a test technique with which you test, but it allows you to focus on the things that you need to test and should be testing, right? Simple process. Make a list of risks and prioritize them. Plan, execute tests that will address these risks. Rinse and repeat as your risks are addressed. That's it. Well, wait a minute. You know, let's say, well, this is just the risk definition. I don't need to dwell on that. But, you know, my previous list of steps is a little bit too simplified, right? We all understand that, you do that and whatnot. But how do we actually get to that point? How do we actually determine what to do? So I put up 5 considerations, and you know, I've been liberally borrowing from people that are much smarter than me, all over, people that I know myself, that I worked with myself, but also people that do write really good articles and really good ideas. So over the years, I've been really depending on developing my own ideas by borrowing from these guys. So, and there's one big difference that in my approach starts to percolate up that is a bit hidden in how other people do risk-based testing. So I wanted to share that with you today. So I have 5 considerations when I'm looking at risks for an organization. And one of the first considerations that I have, and one that is often forgotten, is what is important from a company's point of view, or what is important from an executive management point of view with regards to risk. This is a step that's often forgotten if people do risk analysis, where they go into a deep, you know, detailed risk analysis on all the pieces of software that they have, and they miss the connection with what that does for the company. And I'll get into that, what type of issues you could run into if you do that. So, other considerations that we do, that we look at at critical product characteristics, I call them quality attributes. Understanding your constraints, that's another big area that sometimes do not get the level of attention that it needs to get. Then your history, what happened in the past, what do you know about your environment already, what target issues, target areas did you have in the past, and do you need to repeat them, and what is important in our application and the test. And let me go through each of those considerations and basically talk about that. So on a company level, on a top level, there's a whole series of either constraints or motivations or concerns or what the company wants to do, right? An ability to deliver, you know, like a competitive advantage in the market. Like at the first internet wave in sort of late 90s, early 2000s, we had a lot of products streaming into the market that were, quite frankly, rubbish. But what they did, it was sort of a land grab type activity, right? They carved out, hey, this is the spot where we're sitting, and as long as we occupy the spot and we can keep people entertained for a little while, we can then work our butts off to basically get our software to a higher level, right? So were they concerned with deep software architecture or, you know, arcane SQL optimization, you know, tactics? No, they were not. They were focused on grabbing that piece of the market. So here is a company level concern or a company level driver that basically shapes whatever else you do in the organization, because that's deemed that important. There are other big items that we see, meeting regulatory requirements, particularly if you are you know, bound by keeping to certain privacy and secrecy rules. Anything financial, that is regulated, that you have to comply with and stuff like that. So these are all items that you have to put into your consideration. Other one is meeting shareholder expectation. You can have contractual mandates that you simply have to deliver at a certain time. And sometimes for people who are working on the floor or in a test team, that might not always be as clear as it can be, but that is a big shaper of what work you're going to do. Of course, budget, resource constraints, time constraints, privacy rules. You get it, right? There's a whole level of consideration that plays in your company, and it's different for every company. And here is the point where I'll let you shout out a few things, right? So whenever I have this little icon, it basically means that I get you running and working. But you know, let's take a look at some of these you know, companies that we have there that you know, are quite different in the business that they do, and to see what drives them. So anybody on any of these companies?
Downtime. Yeah, downtime for Facebook. Sure.
Downtime for Facebook. For any of them. Is it more important for Facebook than for a national bank?
No. Just that, well, I'll tell you, losing data for the bank. Yeah, and accuracy.
Accuracy, yeah. A bank would be governed by regulatory rules. So that's a big driver for them. If they can't comply with that, their business will be stopped, right?
Privacy and security.
Pardon?
Privacy and security.
Right, right. Would that be a major concern for, say, the startup or for Facebook? Or we know that Facebook doesn't care about privacy, right? So let's make that clear, right? So whatever you do in Facebook, it's theirs, and they will do whatever they want with it. Okay. You see that each of these companies has a slightly different slant on what is important to them. And you have to recognize that when you're building, say, a test strategy, a test plan, and whatnot. And you know, and quite often this is not an exercise that you have to continually repeat, but you have to make an understanding. You have to create an understanding of where your company sits and what is important for your company. Yes.
You know, it comes to mind with Facebook and the startup, time to market or maintaining competitive advantage would be critical.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, particularly the startup, right? Because nobody is going to fund them if they're not occupying a niche that seems interesting enough, right? It's okay. Let's move on. So let's talk about product characteristics. So each product under test or application under test has what I call quality attributes, and I quickly get into the list what I mean by quality attributes that are important, and others are less important. Identifying their attributes and their relative importance will get to shape your test approach. So for instance, if I have a company that has an online service that needs to deal with waves of users accessing my website, one of my quality attributes could be reliability, stability, performance, and whatnot. That is really, in my focus, because if I don't have that, I'm dead, right? So that's what I mean by quality attributes. And risk can then be identified on your capability to delivering on these attributes. Now let's quickly go to the attributes. There's a lot of them. I call them the ilities, right? So there are basically all these different attributes that we typically look at. So of course we're looking like things like functional correctness, functional completeness, accuracy, usability, etc. I won't list them all, but you see there is a wide variety of attributes that could be important to you or could be less important to you, right? So again, we have Facebook, your personal blog, a medical device, etc., etc. So what type of attributes would be important for these companies?
You better make sure that medical device works.
Yeah, so accurate, you know, stable, predictable, etc., right? It's that's that old story that's always told in testing circles about this X-ray machine that accidentally gave people 100 times the doses, and when people started to drop off, they said, "What's happening here?" And go, "Oh, oops, we made a software error." Oh, that was not good, but. Yeah, you know, for Facebook, different drivers, your personal blog, you know, as long as it shows and it doesn't embarrass you, then, you know, you'll be fine, right? There is no, you know, big range of quality attributes that you need to take care of. A children's educational application might be one where you're focused a bit more on usability and on friendliness, on, you know, easily installable. You know, they can go every which way with it, and it doesn't cause or cause any issues or whatnot. Canada Revenue Agency website, you know, they would be one to have the stability that they can suck in, you know, by the end of April, all these tax reports and whatnot. Yes?
Just a question on that. On that last slide, you had a list of 50 different items on there.
Yeah.
Right? And I looked for those and I thought those were all really important.
Yeah.
How do you really break it down?
Yeah.
You know, what one over another one because of...
Yeah, so let's be clear. Risk assessments are often resulting in we have high risk everywhere. So you just wasted your time, right? Because there's no difference in not doing the risk assessment and saying I have high risk everywhere. So I'll get to the point how you get to evaluate these items and how you try to avoid that, because there are, in every situation, there are items that are more important than others. And you know, give you that simple example where if you do the land grab on having a website, if it is not functionally complete, for instance, fine. We know that. You know, that's not our main driver. You know, we want to be there, and what we have, we want it to be correct. But for the rest, you know, we're okay with that. And one of the things when you do risk assessments, be brutally honest. You know, don't fall in the trap of optimistic and or overly pessimistic, and at that case as well. But be brutally honest, right? Is this important to us? What will happen if this is not there? What will be the impact? How can we recover from this if this happens, etc., etc.? Once you start to ask all these questions, you will start to see some patterns emerging that you can deal with. But you know, I'm now getting ahead of myself, but that's a really good question because it really puts the finger on the sore spot with any risk assessment. Okay? Good. So let's talk about understanding your own constraints in your organization. Now these are things we sometimes whisper in the hallway, but you know, we can have resources or teams in our organizations that are not as effective as you want them to be. And that happens, right? I know it's shocking, but it does happen. So in those cases, you have to include that in your considerations. That yes, if I had the best team in the world, we could turn this around very easily, we could address all these issues very quickly and whatnot, but I know that I'm working with a group of very junior developers. I know that I'm working with just one or two people in testing that also do not have that much experience. So what does that do to me, right? What does it lead me to? The other aspect is technology. So I've seen in the past when a company engages in pursuing new technology, new for that company, or even new in the market, cutting edge type stuff, that your risks are actually expanding significantly just by the mere fact that you're looking at new technology, right? In a case where you're doing the same type of technology for several years with the same teams, you have been successful in rolling out multiple versions of your software, that's a whole different risk profile than if you have, you know, the total 180-degree opposite. So be clear about that, right? Even if people say, well, yeah, it's our core software, but we're sort of refactoring 50% of it, and we're going to use a whole new set of JavaScript libraries to support us. That's a warning flag. That could really impact how you would test. So to take something like that and say, we're going to test it in exactly the same way as we've done before, you might have a mismatch with the risks that you're going to run and what you actually need to do about it. Right? Your budget is a big constraint. You know, you can have, you know, fixed, you know, hell freezes over, you're not going to get any more money out of this, etc., etc. You know, make it work within that constraint. Now, if you make it work in that constraint, if you are in that situation, you now have to say, okay, well, I have this amount of time. How do I divvy up my work to do the right thing in this amount of time, right? If your budget is more variable, or if you work for Google, then, you know, you just do what you need to do. Time, same thing, hard deadline, softer deadline. Quite often our businesses are driven by deadlines, are driven by sales, are driven by, you know, promises that were made on your behalf. And you have to find a way to make it work in your organization. These are tough things, and these are, you know, tough decisions that need to be made. Other factors that come into play: support, infrastructure, test data. What do you have available? What is your capability? So, for instance, if you want to do performance testing, but you know you don't have any knowledge, any infrastructure to help you with that and whatnot, well, you know, if you get a high rating on performance and reliability and stability and scalability, there is something that needs to be done, right? So, and this is where I say be very brutally honest with yourself and say, okay, you know, am I confident we can do this? Oh yeah, you know, performance testing, how difficult can that be, right? Let's just do it. Right? So you might cause yourself additional grief, and in the end not being able to understand your performance or scalability risk to the degree that it needs to be understood. Other constraints, and there's more a context thing, is sort of the methodology. How are you operating? You know, are you a highly agile shop? Are you more sort of a traditional waterfall type shop? You know, how do you fit your activities into your methodology, your way of working? So here I have another list of some of those constraints that could really really be an influence. If I look at the first one, a startup using HTML5 and Android 4.4, which is only available on the Nexus 5 right now, so it's like, you know, cutting edge if you want, right? You're probably going to bump into a whole lot more issues that deal with your cutting edge technology use than in another setup, right? Maintenance on a legacy insurance application. I did some work from ICBC where you had the same people who have been working on the same application for 25 years, right? Different context altogether. There it is actually more difficult to suggest doing something else and new. It's, you know, people tend to get kind of stuck. SAP implementation for National Bank or Facebook Flash game development. These are all different, you know, different companies that have different constraints. Healthcare government. It's in the news massively. You know, in the testing world, we love these disasters, right? Because you can talk about it over and over again, but if you look at it and really look what they have done, it's maybe they have done a risk analysis, maybe they have understood what needed to be done, but they were not effective in implementing any of it. And they ended up with a mitigated disaster, right? Probably one of the bigger ones ever, at least with a lot at stake and a lot of people involved. Okay. So take a look at your history. And quite often, if you are in multiple versions and whatnot, there is a good notion within the company, what are the weak spots? What are the spots that we know that if we push them too hard, they're going to buckle? So take note of those and make sure you address this again. So what were the issues before? Do we know the weak links? What is new? Has our context changed, right? Have we as a company now moved from very well-known technology into new technology, right? What does that do for us? Okay, so let's take a look at our application under test. Now we're driving down. It's one of my approach. I always like to sort of drive down to details and what we're looking at. So what would we typically looking at? This is sort of my sort of preferred list. It's not a law that this is my order, but this is how I start to look at things. So I like to look first and foremost at functionality that's deemed strategic, right? That unique selling point that you have in your application, the reason that people want to use your software and whatnot. You have to make sure that is solid, that you really understand what you need to do there. Of course, then your critical either business processes or functionality that without it you cannot deliver what the system is supposed to deliver. Then we look at ones that are popular, and they could be all the same, but they're not necessarily the same, right? The popular ones are where you potentially have risks with regards to performance, response times, etc., because they get hammered so much. New functionality, change functionality, specifically complex functionality. If you have, say, complex calculations, a complex algorithm that you have that is, that could be, a strategic item in your particular software, you can target that. Precise or precision needed, typically anything with $1 in it needs to be precise and exact and accurate and stuff like that. So if you have upstream or downstream dependencies, so if your information goes to another system that depends on your information, or you need to pull down information from another system that without it you cannot progress. This is the big thing in the healthcare.gov backside of a website. They have so many back-end services that they are depending on, different services from different ministries and different organizations throughout, that is actually a massive risk, because if one of those outstanding services drops out, it means that they cannot deliver what they need to deliver. And whose fault is that? According to the general public, it's the health.gov of the healthcare.gov site, and not so much maybe social services or whomever needed to deliver that information. So this requires sort of a deep understanding of architecture and whatnot. When I did some work at ICBC just fairly recently, they're building a new claims management system. They have 98 of such downstream and upstream dependencies. And we found those particularly on the slow side, but the users were complaining about their new application being slow. But we knew, because we were doing some performance testing there, that there was layers below there, and we could pinpoint what was slow. But the user doesn't care. You know, your website is slow. So now in this interconnected world, this is becoming so much more important. And that can be simple things, right? Where you're depending on a RESTful service from some provider somewhere on the internet, or even you're depending on downloading your JavaScript files from a central location instead of delivering it yourself. You know, what will happen if that central location bombs out, right? Those are the things that you have to consider for that. If you have a distributed application, that's my new word for trouble, distributed, right? So it's often a pain point in situations, and often one that is really hard to figure out. It used to be, my word for trouble used to be third party. And that was at a time where we had third-party libraries in Windows applications and whatnot that, you know, went through many iterations while we were still working on version 1, and now they had version 7.6 coming out, and you decide, well, let's upgrade to that, and suddenly everything stops working, type thing. It's still a bit of an issue if you're using third-party libraries and stuff like that, but definitely keep your eyes open. Any known issues and concerns, of course. Okay, so how do we make this work? This was all good and interesting, but not yet super practical, right? So let's segue into that. How am I doing with time? I have 10 minutes. Okay, it should be good. So there's an availability of risk catalogs, and you know, there is a person who wrote a lot of testing materials called Kem Kane. He wrote a book on testing software. There's catalogs and risks in there on you know, a risk list on common risks that you can use to ask yourself the questions. Because quite often what I see in when people do a risk assessment and they get, okay, installability, is that an issue for you? Go, no. Okay, do you know what installability is? No. So therefore it's not an issue for me. So there's a lot of knowledge that needs to come into play, and a lot of pointers that needs to come into play to determine if this is an issue for you or not, right? So that's where those risk catalogs work with. You know, you have the Software Engineering Institute, they have sort of a risk breakdown. It's very academic, but what it does, it gives you a breakdown in different layers so that you can hold that against your application and say, hey, you know, can we use this model to understand it? There's articles and examples, but the best ones are the ones that you develop yourself, that you grow over time, that you document. So one of the things is, if you do a risk analysis of your own software, take notes. Take notes. Make sure that you know why you decided that this was a low risk. Make notes that you decide, okay, what are the key questions that we needed to ask. So people that have worked with me know that if I start talking to them, and Blair was sort of a, you know, victim of that a bit, I ask questions. What about this? What about so? What if? Why? Etc. Etc. So these are key questions that will allow you to dig up stuff. So decide what to analyze, right? So I don't want this to come across as whenever we do a risk analysis, we have to address everything in the kitchen sink. You know, it would be nice, but sometimes this is not a reality in a company. This is not, supporting the agility or the speediness that a company wants to support, and that's fine. So you can decide on what you want to analyze, and then make sure that you talk to the right people. If you are addressing a quality attribute that speaks to software architecture. And you're not a software architect, you are maybe a business lead or whatnot, don't assume that you know what you're talking about. Right? This is another thing that we see a lot in risk analysis, that, and I'm speaking out of a lot of personal frustration. I do a lot of performance testing work and whatnot, where people have done a risk analysis on performance testing and stability and scalability, and they come up with assessment that I go, where did you get this from? What were you really thinking about? And basically it comes down that they didn't really know that they were talking about it, and say, well, yeah, performance should be okay. We have such a good team, it's fine. Yeah, we're rolling out to 100 million users, but we should be okay, right? So make sure you talk to the right people and you get the right input there, right? Because you can come up to these people and I think, well, isn't performance testing like a low risk for us, or performance or scalability? And a person would say, well, with 100 million users, I think we have to do there something, right? So talk to the right folks. Rate it and determine importance. Now, what's the difference between that? I like to start with a gut feel about things. And a lot of people do. A lot of people do. They say, oh, my gut feel is that I have a concern with this area. I can't really put my finger on it, but I'm concerned enough to want to spend some time to understand it better. So that's your first initial rating. And then later you can determine how that one equates to the other items that you come up with. One of the other pitfalls in risk assessment is that you can spend a lot of time on risk assessment and still miss a lot of stuff. That's our life in testing as well, right? We can do a lot of work in testing, but still miss important stuff. I don't have an answer for that, right? How to fix that or whatnot, except for recognizing what you could be looking at, and then deciding, what are the things that you want to look at based on conversation. Double check the risk distribution. That comes down to your question. It's everything becomes high, right? Okay, let's go home, we're done. It doesn't matter what we do. So you have to push yourself to go beyond the acceptance that a lot of stuff is high. I've been in silly discussions with people. Okay, this is both high. Would you say this one is higher than high or lower than high? Right? So how do they relate to each other? Right? If you have to make a choice, you can only make one choice. If you don't make that choice, you're done. Right? So silly stuff like that. But if you don't apply a little bit of that discipline and be very frank of what you want to do, that's what you can potentially end up with. So during your analysis, ask, what if? What if this scenario? What if that scenario? And explore it, right? And don't fall for sort of the one that people say, that'll never happen. A user will never do that and whatnot. But explore it. What if this would happen? If it technically can happen, it typically will happen sooner or later. But explore it and be very frank of it. There is almost no time or money lost in really going through 5 minutes of a what if question, right? But after you're done and you get the agreement with the people that you're doing the risk assessment with, okay, this is not an issue for us. Fine, you move on to the next one, on to the next one. One of the key questions that I always ask testers that work in my team, in my teams, and people that say, well, we need to test this, we need to test that. I ask them, why do we need to test this? And you're in trouble if people cannot answer that question. Because I think if you do testing work and you cannot answer the question, why am I doing what I do, then you're not doing a great job, right? You're going through maybe motions, you're going through, maybe a set course that somebody set for you and you never questioned. But a lot of this work around risk would involve asking the question, why? Why is this important to us? Why is this not important to us? Why should we be tracking this? And it sounds so simple and almost simplistic, but it is one of the most powerful words in the testing world. Ask why. And often I see it's not done. It's not done consistently. So take a look at things like what is the biggest, what is the most, what is the largest amount of users that we can get, what is the largest numbers that we will have to calculate, etc., etc. Explore the boundaries and the access areas of your applications and of the quality attributes that you're looking at. Are there any other influences playing a role here? Is my application sharing servers with other applications? Do I need to be concerned about that? How do we figure out if that is an issue or not, or do we ignore it? In performance testing, often this is a key issue, right? Because we're looking at systems more holistically, the type of usage that is on that system. If somebody asks me, test this application, and I know it's one of 20 applications running on the same server, I will be really concerned if I prove that this application meets this requirement, but I do that in splendid isolation without all the other applications working. What am I really testing? So take a look at influences that might come around. One of the key questions that I ask is ask people, what are you worried about? What is your particular concern? And if you talk to different people, you get sometimes very different answers. Take them into account. Are there any events you cannot recover from? You get the drift, right? It's really sort of an exploratory exercise where you start to explore the boundaries of what is possible, understand how you would recover from errors, from issues, etc. So this is just one example of a worksheet that you can use, that I've used in the past. And what I like to do, it's almost counterintuitive, but I know that it works. And that is calculate a rating. And for the only reason that if you calculate a rating in an effective and consistent way, you will start to see some of the differences and measure them off to the other items. So the three things that I always like to look at is your initial concern or your initial rating. Well, I'm really concerned about in this particular case high concurrent users on the payment module that we have. I'm really concerned about. I don't know exactly why yet, but that's my first take at it, right? Then during your evaluation, start to understand what a potential impact of issues and problems in that particular area could be. That could very well be, if you can't receive payments, well, most companies don't like that, right? It's, we all like money coming in on a regular basis in large quantities. So impact could be potentially high for a company. You could be impacting, your income flow, your capability to pay your cost, etc. So it could have big ramifications for the company. The likelihood that such a thing could happen, right? And that's the other aspect of risk rating, is not only the impact, but the likelihood that can happen. I have seen risks written up that were a high concern, a high impact, but the likelihood was low. Like that maybe once every 18 months or something like that, this could happen. With the effect that such a high risk and a high impact item actually became quite low on the things that we were testing, right? Sometimes you make those decisions that initially you, out of your gut feel, you say, heck no, we should be testing that. But in comparison to other things, in comparison to how, the impact, in comparison to the likelihood of this occurring, this could very well be, a lower item. Now, I've seen different ways of how people create worksheets. I've seen ones where they do sort of a functional decomposition of all their functionality in there, and then create columns with every single quality attribute in there, and then rate each quality attribute. Now, this is quite a bit of work to do so, but a fairly thorough way of doing so. Now, one caveat: numbers are unequal truth. Okay, so you have to understand that. Sometimes it is handy to have numbers because a lot of people will assume that the number that you're showing is truth. In this case, for us, it's merely a tool to see how we rate different things and how they relate to each other. Okay, so I'm almost done. So be prepared to challenge on your ratings, right? There's people that will not agree with you. So you have to come prepared. Align your rating with what your company needs and your context. We've talked about that. Change your ratings. If your context changes, if your drivers change your ratings. Understand that this is part science and part art, right? There is this not graspable piece of it that is subjective, that's up for discussion, and you have to deal with that. You potentially need less risk analysis in the future, right? If you've gone through a big exercise like that and you're starting to establishing a really solid idea about your company, an understanding of where the issues typically are, you don't have to repeat this every single time. So, relevance to testing. So, how does this now tie into testing? This is the last critical step. So, target the most critical business and areas first and foremost. If your time runs out and you have organized your testing in such a way that you do your important stuff first and foremost, that if your time runs out and you have to drop stuff from the roster, you will almost automatically be dropping stuff that had a lower rating. It still might be an issue, don't get me wrong, but it will be a lower rating, right? You'll be able to identify the need for testing certain quality attributes, right? Again, let's come back to performance because that's such an easy one to do. If you did your risk analysis, you came up with your conclusion, yeah, we really need to do this, and your organization isn't ready for doing that, you know that you have work to do or get in contact with us, for instance, or any other solution in order to bring that online, in order to start doing that. Now, due to your risk analysis, this is also a defendable ask, right? This is not an idea that say, I think we should be doing this. No, we're looking for a defendable ask. Defend your plan. Manage the test work, important stuff gets done first. In case of test scope challenges, you can now effectively communicate what the risk would be, right? So if people say, okay, development took 50% longer than normal. I've never experienced that before, but hey, say, a situation where that would happen. Testing, you have to cut 50% of your stuff. What will this do to us? Well, you have done the analysis, you know what it will do, you have the information, so you can quickly turn that around instead of scratching your head and say, well, I don't think that's a good idea. And go, yeah, but tell me, why isn't this a good idea? Well, we run exposure in this, and this area. These were identified as high risk with a high rating. I would advise against this. Another thing is that you can define where to stop testing, right? If you say, Our target is, let's do all the high-risk areas only, all the way up, and not even bother about the mediums, not even bother about, the lows. Let's do the high-risk areas only. Now you have a very defined scope of what you want to achieve, right? So that's and once you have done the high-risk ones, you can say, okay, we are in a situation where we could stop, but we could also continue with some of our mediums. But, we have now a point in time where we have achieved a certain role. Test cases, we talked about that. Less but more efficient test cases can be specified. A lot of testing that's going on, and even in teams that I led and whatnot, I always have questions. Is this the most effective way that you can test this? Is this addressing some of our key risks and whatnot? And there is almost a human tendency to do easy stuff first and foremost and show production, right? But we all know that the easy stuff is stuff that hardly ever breaks. The difficult stuff, that's where we have issues. The difficult stuff, that's where we need to investigate. And that is hard to do. Better focus tests. Problems areas are discovered early on more risky areas, so we can address that. Overall test goals, directions for testing can be focused and adjusted. And then, risk, you could continuously monitor risk and adjust and whatnot. I have seen situations where we made an attempt to do so, and somehow the energy starts to flag after a while, and it doesn't get that same level of attention. And I'm not too concerned about that, because we've done a lot of good work up front, and we have a good focus. So, quickly, the challenges: optimism bias. Pessimism bias can happen as well. As testers, we're not naturally optimistic of what we have to test and what we have to do. At least I'm not. I'm assuming you're not either. Because if you're an optimistic person, you should be a project manager, right? Yeah, it's like the frog in heated up water, right? It's I had, for instance, people coming into a project, and they go, and we were already in the project for a year, and they go, oh my God, how can you stand this, right? There's so much work and so much pressure. And go, what do you mean? Because we got used to it. We were the frogs in boiling water, right? Yeah. Subjectivity, right? Everybody has their own agenda, own focus. Understand that. Risk recognition, alignment. Get buy-in, because if you want to defend your plan later, but you never got the initial buy-in that this would be a higher risk, you're failing. End of story. You're not getting what you need to get out of it. So one of the things that I've worked a lot in financial services companies, and if it has no dollar in there, risk, smisk, who cares, right? If there's a dollar in there, yeah, make it right, yeah. But that can be an overwhelming push to ignore a lot of other things that might be coming into it. We're doing fine with what we do. We have been doing this for a long time. Why would I want to even change that? So to this particular topic, I did have an item in there, talk to the right people, and what I've tried to do is give you sort of a broader view of influences that come into play. And the user aspect was sort of under focus there, but it's definitely a big piece. Now, in some companies it's easy to get the users' feedback because you have an in-house development group for your own users, etc. In other organizations, it's really tough to get the user feedback because you have a purely external-facing application that can be used by God knows, right? Pretty much everybody. Anyway, let's take a few other challenges. Too much, too heavy for us, right? So, sure, size it to your needs, but there are key thought processes that go into this that can help you. So don't just dismiss it from that point of view. Try to size it to what you do. Great at risk stuff, right? But fine, now I go home, we have to deliver, right? So it's interesting thoughts, but we don't see it, jiving with what our drives are. We have a tolerance for risk. Now, this is one I can say a lot about, but one of my observations is if people say something like that, they can't explain which risks they have a tolerance for. Right? It's sort of related to the items before that, and say, we know what we're doing, we have a tolerance for risk and whatnot. But once you start to talk to them, well, what would happen if, and go, oh my God, we would be dead. And go, isn't that a risk? Yeah, I guess that is a risk, right? So the other side of the coin is we're a risk-averse company. Oh, we try to avoid any risk. Quite often, these companies do not have the largest momentum going forward, but quite often they falling into the same trap that they can't qualify and quantify their risks. Unrecognized risk. We will miss risks, whatever amount of effort we put into. We will miss complex situations, complex cascading errors throughout our systems and stuff like that. You alluded to one of those that you simply could not foresee to a large degree. Well, we have to live with that. Okay. Taking questions or continue conversations? Yes. Right. Yeah. But the problem is with user feedback. They're not there to do that for you. They will complain if they feel compelled so, but most people are just, oh well, don't come back, right? Or leave it there. Having your system being able to understand what your users are doing, how the users are using the system. That's a feature that you could build in that will give you sort of the hard data content with regards to what people are using. If you then get an issue that's reported by a user, hey, something went wrong, and quite rightly so, you say, if I get this one report, I might have 20,000 people experiencing the same thing. But if you don't know if that is indeed the case, you could be sort of changing after something that's not really there, right? So it's a combination of things. I have less confidence in our fellow humans than maybe you. I don't necessarily think that they're collectively smarter. They're more like a school of fish that suddenly. That's appropriate for your situation, but a school of fish that suddenly changes direction, right? It is that detection of changing direction that will allow you to understand, oh, wait a minute, what's happening here? Why are they using it in this particular way? Oh, I got the one or two reports that somebody had an issue with it. Now you can put the two and two together, and now you have something that is actionable for you, right? It's instead of putting the onus on the user, there is more that we can often do within our systems ourselves. Just an idea. One experience there with usability tests. The best people you can get in such a sort of a guided activity are people who are actually willing to speak while they're doing stuff, instead of just being quiet and trying stuff, but people who are almost, voicing their thoughts while they're going, because that takes a special kind of person to be able to do that effectively, and then it's really, really effective.